of breathing. So breathing, or ventilation, is the movement of air from outside the body into the bronchial tree and the alveoli. The actions responsible for those air movements are inspiration and expiration, also called inhalation and exhalation. So one inspiration and the following expiration is what we refer to as the respiratory cycle. Atmospheric pressure is the force that's going to move air into the lungs. We can talk about the pressure at sea level. At sea level, that is approximately 760 millimeters of mercury. And when respiratory muscles are at rest, the atmospheric pressure and the alveolar pressure are equal. Pressure of volume in gases is inversely related. You might recall Boyle's law. If pressure inside the alveolar, the intra-alveolar pressure, decreases, the atmospheric pressure pushes air into the airways. That occurs during a resting inspiration, a normal quiet inspiration, as the phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm to contract downward. The volume of the thoracic cavity would then increase, which would, because of Boyle's law, decrease the pressure from 760 millimeters of mercury down to 758 millimeters of mercury approximately. And in response to that pressure, air would rush into the thoracic cavity. During normal quiet inspiration, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles would then enlarge the size of the thoracic cavity, and the lung expansion is also aided by the surface tension within the pleural cavity. Surfactants reduce surface tension in the alveoli and help the lung expand. But if you're going to take a deep or forced maximal inspiration, you're going to require the contraction of several other muscles to enlarge the thoracic cavity even more. So here is a comparison of the normal inspiration and the maximal inspiration. So you would include the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, the pectoralis minor, the that would be the additional ones. So the major events include impulse conducted to the conducted on the phrenic nerve to the muscle fibers in the diaphragm, contracting them. As the dome-shaped diaphragm moves downward, the thoracic cavity expands. At the same time, the external intercostal muscles contract, raising the ribs, further expanding the thoracic cavity. That leads to intra-alveolar pressure decrease. Atmospheric pressure, which would then be greater than the intra-alveolar pressure, forces air into the respiratory tract through the air passages, and that causes the lungs to fill with air. Expiration, for normal resting breaths, is a passive process for the most part. The elastic recoil of the lung tissue and the abdominal organs as they return to their original shape at the end of inspiration. The surface tension that's on the moist surfaces of the alveolar shrink, and combined, those factors increase the intra-alveolar pressure by about 1 millimeter of mercury above atmospheric pressure, but that is enough to force air out of the lungs. So again, resting or normal quiet expiration is a passive process. It does not require the contraction of muscles. However, if we do have a forced expiration, if we're doing something exerting, or we're blowing up a balloon, then we get contraction of the internal intercostal muscles as well as abdominal muscles. So in an expiration, the diaphragm and external respiratory muscles would relax. The elastic tissue of the lungs, stretched during inspiration, would recoil. Surface tension would also pull on the alveolar walls, and that would increase the intra-alveolar pressure, forcing air out of the lungs. So there are some volumes and capacities of the lungs that we can measure using a machine called a spirometer. There are things like the inspiratory reserve volume, the vital capacity, the inspiratory capacity, the total lung capacity, expiratory reserve, residual. All of these are going to be important in differentially determining what kind of lung disease is going on in a patient. So I will walk you through this a little bit. I won't go to the description, but the tidal volume is the volume of air that's moved in and out during the respiratory cycle. The inspiratory reserve is the maximum volume of air. Expiratory reserve is the maximum volume you can exhale. Residual volume is air that remains in the lungs no matter what you do. It's never emptied. The vital capacity is the air that can be used. It's the air inside the alveoli. Inside healthy alveoli. Inspiratory capacity is the amount you can inhale following exhalation of a resting tidal volume, and functional capacity is the volume of air that remains in the lungs following exhalation of resting tidal volume. And there are formulas to calculate each one of those. The respiratory volumes can be measured with a spirometer. The respiratory capacities can be calculated by using those volume measurements. There is dead air space in the lungs. Some of the air entering the respiratory tract during breathing doesn't reach functional alveoli. Those are called dead spaces. There is some anatomical dead space, which is the air in the respiratory tract that hasn't gotten to the alveoli. There is alveolar dead space if air gets into an alveoli that does not correctly exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the blood for whatever reason. And the total would be the physiological dead space. An alveolar ventilation can be described as the minute respiratory volume, or MRV. The volume of new atmospheric air moved into the respiratory passages each time. That should be equal to the tidal volume times the breathing rate. And that should mean that the tidal, since some of that new air in each breath remains in physiological dead space, another figure can be calculated to represent the actual amount of inhaled air that reaches the alveoli in a minute. And that would be the alveolar ventilation rate, which is the tidal volume minus the physiological dead space multiplied by the breathing rate. And that becomes an important value since it impacts the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli. There are some non-respiratory air movements. Air moves through some clear air passages, as in coughing. Some of these move clear air passages, as in coughing and sneezing. Some are used to express emotion, as in laughing and crying. Usually they result from reflexes, but sometimes they can be started voluntarily. So coughing, sneezing, laughing, crying, hiccuping, yawning, and speech. Those are non-respiratory air movements. Respiratory disorders that decrease ventilation would include bronchial asthma and emphysema. Bronchial asthma is an allergic reaction to a foreign antigen in the airway, such as pollen. In small airways, mucus and secretions from allergic responses can accumulate, since not many of those cells are ciliated. Allergens and secretions can irritate smooth muscle, which also leads to bronchoconstriction and wheezing. Emphysema is a progressive degenerative disorder in which the alveoli walls are destroyed. Clusters of alveoli would merge into larger ones, decreasing the total surface area for gas exchange. The alveolar walls would lose their elasticity and their capillaries would diminish. It is a type of COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, along with chronic bronchitis. Controlling of the breathing. Normal breathing is a rhythmic, involuntary act that continues when a person is unconscious. Respiratory muscles can also be controlled voluntarily. The respiratory areas are groups of neurons in the brainstem that control breathing. initiate impulses that travel on cranial and spinal nerves, causing inspiration and expiration. Respiratory areas also adjust the rate and depth of breathing. The major ones include the medullary respiratory centers and the pontine respiratory group. Basic rhythm of breathing is derived from the ventral respiratory group. The dorsal respiratory group stimulates the muscles of inspiration, primarily the diaphragm, while the pontine respiratory group limits the duration of inspiration. Partial pressures. In any mixture of gas, each gas contributes to a portion of the total pressure. I think this is Charles' law. Partial pressure is the amount of pressure each gas contributes to the total pressure. It is proportional to its concentration. Air is about 21% oxygen. Atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. So 0.21 times 760 equals 160. We would say that 160 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level. Factors that affect breathing, the number of factors: partial pressure of O2, partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ions in body fluids, degree of stretch of the lung tissue, our emotional state, the level of physical activity. There are receptors involved in that are mechanoreceptors, and there are peripheral chemoreceptors. The major controlling factor is generally carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, which equates to pH, and we'll talk about how those two are related momentarily. So there are central chemoreceptors in the ventral part of the medulla oblongata. They monitor pH in the brain. Low blood oxygen does not have much effect on these receptors. Hydrogen ions from the periphery don't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. But carbon dioxide does cross the blood-brain barrier. So if there's high levels of carbon dioxide, they cross the blood-brain barrier and in the brain combine with water to produce bicarbonate ion, carbonic acid. So they produce carbonic acid, H2CO3. That carbonic acid immediately almost dissociates to produce hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ion. That means, in a roundabout way, the hydrogen ion concentrations in the brain are a direct reflection of the carbon dioxide levels. The peripheral chemoreceptors sense changes in partial pressure of oxygen. They are found in the carotid and aortic bundles. So a decrease in oxygen concentration causes an increase in breathing rate and tidal volume, leading to an increase in respiration or ventilation. However, these usually don't respond until the oxygen gets to below 50% of its normal value. So normally the driving force for breathing is carbon dioxide levels. There is an inflation reflex known as the Herring-Bauer. It helps regulate the depth of breathing. So as the lung tissue stretch during inspiration, stretch receptors are stimulated. There's a sensory impulse travels over the vagus nerve to the respiratory areas, and the duration of inspiratory burst is then shortened. That helps to prevent overinflation of the lungs, especially during forced breathing. So some factors that affect breathing include stretch of tissues, low plasma oxygen levels, high plasma carbon dioxide levels, and high cerebral spinal fluid hydrogen ion concentration, which would be a result of carbon dioxide levels. Exercise can increase the amount of oxygen used each minute and the amount of CO2 produced. So during exercise, an increased breathing rate would expect to result from a decrease in blood O2 and an increase in CO2. However, our breathing rate increases, blood levels and CO2 levels of blood levels of O2 and CO2 really don't change significantly. The increased breathing rate during exercise is a result of cerebral cortex and something called the joint reflex. Exercise increases the demand of both respiratory and cardiovascular systems, and those systems have to keep up with that demand. If shortness of breath occurs, it's usually due to the cardiovascular system not moving enough blood, not in the inspiration of air. All right, and I'm going to quit there.